welcome to Borderlines. We are here today to discuss the recently launched book. I think it was last week that Petra Molnar's book, The Walls Have Eyes, Surviving Migration in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, has recently been launched. I'm going to try and give you an image of it. We were just talking about the very striking image on the cover of her book. But ultimately, the book. So welcome, Petra. It's very nice to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for
And
having me.
oh, it's a thrill to have you here to discuss your book, which describes, as the title suggests, the many ways that artificial intelligence and just surveillance has increased over the years, and what the impact has been on migration and on transient communities, essentially, and the research that you've been doing over many years. So I just perhaps you can tell us how the idea for writing this book arose in the first place.
Sure. I think that's always a good place to start.
Mhm.
I'm not a technologist by training. I am a refugee lawyer and an anthropologist. And, 6, 7 years ago, I didn't really know what an algorithm was or what some of these technologies were. We're talking like Wikipedia level knowledge of trying to figure this out. But we held an event at work at the University of Toronto, kind of on tech and power more broadly. And it started me kind of wondering what is happening with technology and migration. And back in 2018, we ended up writing a report with the Citizen Lab, bringing together legal analysis with automated decision making that has been happening in Canada on visa triaging applications and other types of immigration decisions. And I have to tell you, no one was more surprised than me at how much this attention this little report got. And it kind of opened up my own eyes to try and use technology as a lens to kind of illuminate what is happening at the border. And because I'm also an ethnographer and an anthropologist, I kind of toggle between these two hats. I have this commitment of trying to be present in the spaces where a lot of this technological experimentation happens. And then I got some funding to expand the project. So looking beyond Canada, but towards, the fringes of Europe and the Middle East, East Africa, and the US-Mexico border, all of which became these sites that are profiled in the book. But ultimately, the book is not an academic book. It's more around storytelling and kind of bringing in the personal journeys of the people who are at the sharpest edges of technological development. Because otherwise, I find so much of this can be very, very abstract for people. Even though I think more audiences are becoming aware of how surveillance and technology is harming people, it's really about the personal stories of those who are impacted that I wanted to highlight.
How do you think your
Mhm.
background in anthropology has influenced, I guess, your career trajectory?
Yeah, it was a huge influence. I never planned to be a lawyer, and I am a reluctant lawyer at best.
Mhm.
And I think I see law as a toolkit, but it's actually my anthropological background that has served me the most in the kind of person-driven, relationship-oriented work that I do. It's a slow methodology. It takes a long time. There's a reason why it took 6 years to do this book. But I think that's actually a good thing because it allows you to kind of unpick the complexities of human movement slowly and carefully. And I think there's just nothing like being present in a space and seeing things manifest with your own two eyes. There's just, that can't be replicated. And I find sometimes in the law, because it's more of a profession that deals with facts or evidence, and we are circumscribed to work in specific ways. Anthropology is a little broader, and so trying to mix these two together has actually worked quite well. There's also tensions, of course, and sometimes it doesn't fit together perfectly, but
Yeah.
maybe that's
Well,
a
I
good thing
mean,
too.
like, I think that's a good description because the book doesn't read like a pictureless legal textbook. First of all, it has some pictures, but then it also has like it's a lot more story driven than straight. This is the law. This is I don't even know if statutes are specifically cited. It's more the story of different flashpoints across the world And I think in order to get into that, Deanna and I were talking before, like, do you think you could, or either of you could do just a 2-minute summary on what the Refugee Protection Convention obliges states to do? Because that's kind of the underpinning of all these different surveillance technologies that are basically designed to prevent that convention from arguably working as it should. So what does that convention oblige states to do?
Yeah, that's really the foundation on which all of this work is built. The fact that there is an international regime of refugee protection that's enshrined in the 1951 Refugee Convention and its accompanying protocol, and then the laws that came out of that, that stipulate that every person on the planet has a right to seek asylum, and a right to leave their country, and also underpinned by the normative principle of what's called non-refoulement, so not being returned to the country that you're fleeing from. And that's the foundation. A lot of states and countries proudly signed up for this, brought it into their domestic legislation. And yet it rubs up against this increasingly violent border system that is now full of surveillance. So for sure, it kind of begs the question, what does this do to these established legal frameworks? And why are we derogating from them so much, right? It's almost like states kind of want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to say, oh, we uphold refugee protection and we have these robust human rights standards, et cetera, et cetera. But also we want a lot of surveillance and we want to actually deter or prevent people from even being able to exercise these internationally protected rights. There's this tension, and that's
Yeah,
something I
it's
saw
a
at so
super
many
interesting
borders.
tension.
Yeah.
This is why I really like the way that your book tries to remain in the frame of storytelling, because there are sort of limitations in what we can accomplish as lawyers, because as lawyers we're stuck in these frames of rules and requirements and legal systems. But I think when you tell it from this storyteller's perspective, there is the idiosyncrasy that is immediately there when you look at it from the perspective of, this is what the Refugee Convention promises and this is what we've agreed to, and yet there are all these systems now set up to make it as difficult as possible to actually arrive at our borders to make those claims. And as you have demonstrated by going to some of these most difficult border crossings, that even when people arrive, this experience of the pushback, that people that know you have not arrived, like the gaslighting and the actual physical pushback, and how now how AI is being deployed in order to prevent people from ever being able to use those rights. But sticking with it in this narrative way to just show the hidden irony in a way.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think ultimately it's about the personal. It's about the people and the communities that are being harmed by this unbridled rollout of super high risk technologies that are also highly unregulated. I think it's disturbing for people, kind of as a concept or an idea, but what really brings it home is the fact that, we're not just talking in abstract terms, but really witnessing people be harmed by this kind of sharpening of borders. And that's something that I saw time and time again across all the different contexts that I've worked in. And for sure, thank you for bringing up the kind of practices of pushbacks and pullbacks and interdictions and things like that, because it's also forcing us to rethink the concept of the border. I mean, the border is no longer just the physical location, but it's kind of been disaggregated through policies and technologies, either vertically into the sky when you have drones, scanning all the way up there, but also horizontally, because if, for example, the European Union or the United States wants to push its border as far away from its physical location as possible, that's to make it easier for the kind of logic of bordering to happen, right? If a person can't even enter European territory or US territory to claim asylum, well, then it's kind of like its job is done, right? So the border as a concept is also shifting, and technologies allow for that to happen.
Let's get into some of those technologies, because for me, this was probably, I mean, there were a lot of interesting parts of the book. This part leaped out to me, and it's something that I think anyone, regardless of their politics or even knowledge level, I think we'll learn from the book with regards to what you described, the border industrial complex, which is obviously a play on Eisenhower's military industrial complex. And you talked about the World Border Congress, and the different companies. I'm not sure where I want to go with this, either describing the World Border Congress or what you think maybe some of the companies that people should know about in this space, that when they think of here's how borders operate, here are kind of the big players from the private sector side.
Sure. I mean, the private sector is such a major actor in all of this. So I'm glad that we're delving into that, because to me, that was probably one of the more shocking things that I've seen again and again across these different contexts, is how disproportionately powerful the private sector is. And, you know, you mentioned the World Border Security Congress. That's a conference, an international one, where basically private sector actors sell their wares to buyers, oftentimes states. And, you know, you go into these cavernous halls and you see tanks and drones and robodogs and facial recognition and everything in between. And it's very disturbing how normalized it's become. And it also becomes very clear that it's big business. Companies make a quick buck at the border at the expense of people's lives. And then it also kind of, you know, problematizes the idea of any kind of governance and regulation, because it's like, if you make a lot of money at the border, why would you want to regulate? And there are so many companies that are involved. I mean, that's actually probably one of the hardest parts of doing this work, tracing the money and trying to figure out who these actors even are. You know, there's players that might be familiar to your audiences, like Palantir, Clearview AI, Elbit Systems, for example, from Israel, Celebrite, Airbus, Thales, these big companies. But what I found troubling too is actually the small and medium-sized actors that are involved too, and kind of also set the agenda of what we innovate on and why. And if I can bring it to a specific example, there was one company in particular called Brink, which was started by some young guy in Silicon Valley who thought it would be a good idea to take a drone and put a taser on it and have this drone fly around the US-Mexico corridor, picking out people who are likely to be migrants, tasing them, and waiting for the Customs and Border Protection officer to come.
Holy moly.
Luckily, this wasn't rolled out in real time, but he got millions to develop this idea. And that is so disturbing to me, the fact that this even can happen to that phase, right? That there is some guy who thinks this is a good idea. Same with the AI lie detectors and other types of really problematic projects like robodogs. It just really forces us to examine, like, who is really in a place of power to make these decisions. Because it's very clear whose priorities matter here, right? Like, we're developing robodogs and drones with tasers, and not using AI to root out racist border guards or create psychosocial supports or anything like that. It's always skewed against the people who are crossing borders and not the other way around.
Or the images you gave of the refugee encampments that are kitted up with biometrics and all sorts of other surveillance mechanisms, but don't have running water. And that's another example.
Do you want to
Yeah,
elaborate on oh sorry. Go ahead. Oh, just on Palantir, because I was chatting with someone from government yesterday who was saying, like, when it comes to AI and border management, that Palantir's a company that in Canada as well that everyone should know about. And I actually don't know much about it. So do you want to elaborate on what Palantir is and what it does?
Sure. So Palantir is an interesting actor to follow, not just in border surveillance, but generally, because they are a major player internationally in kind of normalizing surveillance technologies, and also being involved in all sorts of public-private partnerships. So when a company is contracted to do the work of a particular government, for example, including the Canadian government. One thing I was really shocked by a few years ago was when a bunch of us learned that Palantir was on the preferred vendor list, for example, for the Canadian government, without public scrutiny or anything like that. It's one of those companies that has, I would say it's fair to say, a dubious human rights record globally. They've been implicated in spyware, in inappropriate data sharing, in just funding and normalizing the incursion of really high-risk surveillance often weaponized against marginalized communities and dissidents and others who are speaking out against this. So yeah, it's interesting, right? That companies like this are the ones who get the government contracts and are able to set the agenda on what is happening. But again, Palantir is one of many companies internationally that are doing this. I think it's just one that's perhaps a little bit more well known, also because of its founder, Peter Thiel. He has ties to all sorts of white supremacy groups, the Trump campaign, and also political influence in really outsized ways. So it's not just a company, it's a really powerful actor in this kind of ecosystem.
Yeah, I didn't know Peter Thiel was the founder of it. And that just like all these connections that start getting drawn.
Yeah, it's a sticky web. And trying to understand how it all fits together was really overwhelming at first, because you kind of pull a strand and then it starts unraveling and you realize like, oh my gosh, all of this is kind of connected with broader conversations, right, that are being had about the rise of the far right, anti-migrant sentiments, the growth of the surveillance industry.
Yeah.
This is all interconnected.
One thing I like was curious in reading, I didn't see a lot of Chinese companies
Mm.
mentioned. Is that just because the purchasers would be Western governments, and so Chinese companies are just not allowed in, or because I would
Yeah,
have
that's
thought that when it comes to surveillance technology companies, they would be, specialists in it. Is it just Western governments won't purchase from them?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons. And the other reason why China wasn't kind of a major case study is just because of space and time. I would point you to the work of another anthropologist, Darren Byler, who's been doing really amazing work on Chinese surveillance, particularly of the Uyghur population, an ethnic minority inside China. But yeah, I mean, it is a major player in terms of just normalizing surveillance on its own citizenry, right? And I think it will be interesting to see whether some of these contracts will become more numerous in the coming years, for sure.
Yeah. I think you'd
Hard to know
mentioned
though.
Kenya was also in your book. Kenya was also normalizing spying on its own citizenry, or at least certain minority groups.
Yeah, that's right. And also introducing a digital ID system. Not the only jurisdiction. India has the Aadhaar system and a few others as well. But it is kind of done under the guise of collecting more data, creating an identity system, which on some level is important, because if you don't have ID, then you're also disenfranchised, right? Like what happens with the Nubian community in Kenya that I had a chance to visit with. But it's also important to query, like, why are the digital ID systems actually developed, and are they for the purposes of data sharing also with Western governments, for example? It's always important for me to try and highlight the kind of power dynamics too between Western nations and the majority world countries that also then act as either data brokers or the places where data is actually gathered from, and this kind of data colonialism, sometimes
Yeah.
people call it.
The other part of your book, and I made a specific note to ask about, was when you described in Canada the use of ankle monitoring, which I think everyone is familiar with to some degree, that someone won't be in prison or detention if they're wearing this ankle monitor. But then you had a brief sentence where you talked about the charging concept. And it's one of those, or the charging issue. And it's one of those things that, like, it's the type of thing that when I'm reading a book, I'll often just focus on and be like, oh, I hadn't thought of that before. And what is the charging process? Like, I'd never, until reading your book, it had never dawned on me. Like, of course, if you have this ankle bracelet mandatory on your ankle, how do you charge it?
Mhm.
Like, how do you? How many hours do they just sit by the wall? Like, how does that actually work?
That's such a great thing to pick up on. I mean, immigration detention is an issue close to my heart, because that's what I used to practice before I moved more towards the academic policy side of things. So I was glad I could weave it into the book a little bit. But yeah, these kind of wearable carceral technologies are really disturbing too, because then it's like your body becomes a part of the carceral state in a way. And
Yeah.
I think you're referring to that sentence where I was also quoting a movie that director Amar Walla did years ago, where 5 men were subject to security certificates in Canada. And as one of
Yeah.
the, during the really, really long process, they were given the option of wearing ankle monitors instead of being in detention. And they found it so intrusive to their family life and their mental health, that they all basically went back to detention. And one of the reasons was because they had to sit basically plugged in to the wall for hours at a time.
So it is
I mean,
hours. That's what I was like, do you just sit like, are they just expected to sit there with a 3 foot extension cord charging themselves basically because they're connected to this thing?
so that's how it used to be. I mean, the technology has developed.
Yeah.
The ankle monitors are much smaller. They're a little bit less clunky. There's also other ways, right, that carceral technology can manifest, whether it's even a facial recognition app that they were
Mhm.
piloting in the United States. But still, it's this kind of incursion into everything you do, right? And then there is something unique about the body also being involved, right? That's the same thing we see with biometrics. When you have to have your fingerprint scanned or your
Yeah.
irises scanned, it kind of your body becomes a border in a way, in a really visceral kind of way that maybe some of the other technologies are a little bit more removed from you.
Yeah, the other part that I that was just interesting, like just not what I had expected was how the UNHCR is also involved with all of these technologies. And maybe if you want to just walk through like someone, I guess, shows up at a refugee camp, and I think people will have the images of the tents and what goes on in terms of lugging these people metaphorically into this digital surveillance system.
Yeah, so the UNHCR, so that's the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the agency that manages a lot of refugee responses in humanitarian settings, is a major player here too. It's kind of third actor, so to speak, right? Because they're not a state and they're not a private company. And they're also at the front lines of a lot of forced migration and humanitarian emergencies. So they've been setting the agenda on a lot of what I would say is kind of normalization of the tech. And what sometimes happens in certain contexts, like in northern Jordan, in the Azraq camp there, just as an example, one of many now, there was an introduction of biometric technology, so iris scanning,
Yeah.
in exchange, so basically they introduced that to create a more high-tech way of being able to screen people and be able to verify their identity for example, food rations. So it all sounds good, right? Like you want to be able to give people food quickly, it's more efficient, et cetera, et cetera. But then when you actually start speaking with people who are subjected to this technology, a lot of them felt it was very intrusive, right? I mean, how would we feel if we went to a local Loblaws or a Safeway or a store like that and had to have our irises scanned before getting the food, right? There's something very visceral about it.
Yeah.
But a lot of people felt like they couldn't say no, right? Because it's like you either get your eyes scanned or you don't eat that week. So free and informed consent really breaks down here. And another example comes to mind, a disturbing one at that. We also have to query what kind of data protection practices UNHCR has in place. Because, for example, they collected a lot of personal information from Rohingya refugees who were escaping Myanmar and ended up in Bangladesh in places like Cox's Bazar, but then inadvertently shared this information with the Myanmar government, the very place that the refugees were fleeing from. And Human Rights
Inadvertent because of
Watch,
a leak, or what was the,
that's a little unclear.
yeah.
And Human Rights Watch broke the story a few years ago. And of course, there was, a lot of contrition and all of this. But what's disturbing is that we don't really know the strict parameters of what kind of data protection and data retention practices there are. And why is so much data even being collected in the first place, right?
Has it changed what you had your relationship with your phone doing this work?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I'm a pretty private person. I am on Twitter for work, and that's about it. I don't really use social media very much unless I absolutely have to for the work.
Is that a result of this work? Like it's shifted your perspective,
Mm,
or you've kind of always had that?
I've always kind of had that, but definitely, doing this work and also then being on the sharpest edges of surveillance myself and my team. We were multiple times we've had to have our phone checked, for example, by our colleagues at the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. They've been doing amazing work with us for years. There was a lot of spyware in Greece a few years ago when I was living there. basically phones of people who do human rights work or border work
Yeah, I think you
being
mentioned
tapped
someone,
directly.
I don't think it was you, but someone in your group
Yeah,
detected
that's
a
right.
bunch of spyware on their phone.
Yeah, it was a Greek journalist, colleague of ours. So, you know, definitely it changes your relationship with technology and with surveillance kind of generally. And I think you just kind of become more aware of how much of it is out there. But then, you know, it's interesting too, right? I travel quite a lot for work and have spent some time in the States recently. And a lot of the airport kind of experiences are becoming super automatic, right? Like on a recent flight from Boston to Toronto, there was facial recognition at the gate. So like you don't even interact with a gate agent anymore. You just go through, they scan your face and you go on. And part of me wanted to like say, oh, I don't want to do this. You know, I'm just going to take a stand. But I just thought, okay, I'm going to experience it and see what it's like. Um, it's everywhere now. And when you do this kind of work, you really become aware of that.
It's interesting how things do become normalized. Like, I mean, I think we're all old enough to remember when you could have metal knives on a plane, which would never happen now. But even just when those machines that you would stand in and it would circle you to do that X-ray, and at the time the people were upset. Now it's just, oh yeah, like technology gets introduced, there's the initial outrage, and it feels like 1 to 2 years later, it's the norm.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And there is so much rhetoric around the surveillance that we don't, there's not the will to kind of probe beyond it. You know, we're doing the surveillance for health purposes, for security purposes, you know, we don't really question it. I don't know if we really could, because again, it would take some pretty deep probing to figure out exactly what that information is being used for. Um, and also, I mean, you did talk a fair bit about just overall the criminalization of humanitarian work. And so you're already kind of working in this gray zone. And I think to try and accomplish the goals that you're trying to achieve, you're sort of walking in a fine line. You're not trying to ruffle too many feathers at any time. So you know, it's kind of a recurring theme throughout the book, always trying to avoid detection yourself in terms of the humanitarian work that you've been trying to do.
Yeah, for sure. You know, and then they don't make it easy either, because oftentimes you're investigating things that powerful actors don't want you to see, right? So, and different people have different risk appetite, I guess you could say, for doing border work and humanitarian work. But you know, you find a way, because I think when there is an important story to tell, it becomes really critical to find the way, what's kind of illuminating the issues that are happening at the border and in airports and places like that.
Yeah, but when humanitarian work ends up coming with the fear of being prosecuted for things like human trafficking or human smuggling, it does make you wonder whether or not we're losing the plot on what the purpose of those offenses are supposed to be, especially when you're describing the pushback, pullback, you know, these types of experiences that are people are encountering when trying to get to a place where they can make a refugee claim. That the idea that humanitarian workers are facing fears that they themselves are going to be criminalized for trying to assist people in arriving in safe haven, that's something that has dogged you throughout those efforts. You know, I don't know that that's something that people are generally aware of, that that's something that that is of issue. They think of human smugglers, human traffickers as being people that are categorically bad people, and not that there wouldn't be that kind of confusion arising.
Absolutely. And you know, seeing sorry, one second. I'm so sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, you know, there's so much humanity at the border. And for me, seeing the people kind of show up and do this work, it really pulls apart all of these kind of framings of like human trafficking, human smuggling, all of this. So first of all, I mean, the law even recognizes, right, that you can avail yourself of assistance, if we can put it this way, for the purposes of getting you to a place where you can seek safety. And we've forgotten about that, right? Not to mention that with the criminalization of movement and migration and making refugee determination extremely difficult, people have had to step in, right? People like the search and rescuers that I've worked with in Arizona, who, by the way, a lot of them are like 70, 80-year-olds who could be retired, on a sun lounger somewhere. And yet they show up to the border, shuffling across sometimes, but they do it because they feel like they must. Or, the story of a swimmer and a diver, Sarah Mardini, comes to mind, who herself is a Syrian refugee. And her colleague Sean Binder were charged with all sorts of charges in Greece because they were assisting people who were drowning as they were crossing into Greek territory. There's also Scott Warren, who was doing, water drops in the Sonoran Desert and was criminalized as well. Luckily, a lot of those charges have been dropped, but it definitely creates like a massive chilling effect on people who would otherwise be doing the work. But then on the other hand, you also see so much solidarity and so many people still showing up that I don't think it's deterring people in any way, actually.
What, like,
Myself included.
So one of the parts of your book that I found, or just one of the stories, I guess, was also this notion almost of like asylum seekers as some sort of a political tool or weapon. Like I think you mentioned that at one point, at the behest of either the Belarus or Russian government, planes left a bunch of Middle Eastern countries, and then migrants went from, I guess, Minsk or wherever the planes went to the Polish border. But can you go into that more? Because when I read like this multi-country coordinated effort to force refugees into Poland at the behest of Putin, was that like kind of an accurate summary?
I mean, yeah, that's such a complicated context. One of the more interesting ones, I think, in the book for me, something that I want to think more about for the second book, maybe. But yeah, you're referring to this incident that happened where, so the Lukashenko regime in Belarus decided to make visas available to a lot of people in, for example, Iraqi Kurdistan, and fly them into Minsk, the capital city of Belarus, and then bus them over to the Belarusian-Polish border, and essentially weaponized migration as a way to try and get sanctions lifted that were imposed by the European Union on the Belarusian regime, which is largely a regime led by a dictator and, a really problematic one at that, that's been repressing journalists and human rights critics and anyone in between. So, but what that created then is Poland militarized its border with, more personnel, armed as well, more surveillance and tech that they were actually learning about from Greece. So that direct connection between what Greece has been doing at the Greek-Turkey border, kind of getting imported into the Poland-Belarusian corridor. And then also a 5-kilometer exclusion zone where you were not allowed to enter if you were either a human rights monitor like me or a journalist, for the purposes of, again, militarizing this border. And it kind of created the stalemate where hundreds of people were trapped in this kind of no-go zone. And as the weather kept getting colder, people actually froze to death in the Polish forests. And I think this story is a really important one because, like you say, it highlights the kind of transnational weaponization of migration and turning it kind of into a political tool to get what you want from the established order. But I will also say there was a lot of interesting solidarity there too. Like one thing that's just burned in my memory is we were in this exclusion zone. It's one of those choices you make when you do the work because
Yeah, I think you described you were walking in the desert at night yelling marhaba
trying to find people who were scared to come out. And so we were there and got invited into a newly created safe house that was just a random, beautiful little tiny house that belonged to a Polish farmer who just happened to live in the newly created exclusion zone. He had no prior, exposure to migration or anything like that. And I don't even really know what his politics were, but he decided that this was wrong. And he opened up his house to a bunch of kids from Warsaw who came to like pack little, rescue packets, for example, full of juice and socks and food. And then like a group of us there doing this work. And I just remember opening the door and it was like a fairy tale. There was like dry herbs on the wall and honey cake that was freshly baked for us on the table. And it was just such a reminder that, people show up, right? Like they say, this is not okay. And we're going to do whatever we can to to try and improve the situation, even in some small way like this.
And I mean, your book, I think, was written just after October 7, which I think is mentioned briefly. And on this topic of automated borders, like there still have to probably be these big inquiries as to what exactly happened. But was that, because my understanding was the border with Gaza was largely automated. And in your work that you've seen, was that just, I mean, from what you know, is that just the automation, like they somehow turned it off, or that, like, what happened there as far as that being an automated border failure?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, the book unfortunately wasn't able to get into what happened after October 7th because of, publication timelines, but I did work in the occupied West Bank earlier that year, which we can also talk about. But the Gaza situation in particular, yeah, it definitely highlights kind of two elements of border tech. One being that, you can have an extremely smart border and a militarized border, but at the end of the day, it's also about, the people who are there trapped in the system. And the other element of it too is the kind of automated weapon systems that have been used inside Gaza and kind of piloted on Palestinians and then resold everywhere else in the world. I think Palestine in particular is the kind of ultimate testing ground. And a colleague of mine, Anthony Lewinstein, who's a Jewish Australian journalist, wrote an amazing book called The Palestine Laboratory on precisely this, looking at how technologies are battle tested, often in spaces like this, and then resold for border enforcement purposes. Because then you have similar technology used at the EU border and the US border. The Sonora Desert, for example, has Israeli Elbit Systems towers that first made their appearance in the occupied West Bank and Gaza.
And what's an
So,
Elbit system tower?
so Elbit Systems is an Israeli surveillance company that created these stationary AI towers, basically, of surveillance. So they kind of sweep the desert in the Sonora. I just went to see one a couple days ago. There's a bunch of them there. They're just, yeah, they're in the beautiful but deadly Sonora, kind of almost like a Lord of the Rings tower. It really looks like something like that.
Yeah, I I mean, so one, like reading your book, like a lot, going back to the Refugee Convention, this all stems kind of from governments having this obligation to accept refugee claims. And as I was reading the book, I kept thinking like, there's a lot of money going to stopping governments from living up to the obligations that they've signed. I'm surprised that they don't just pull out of these conventions. And in all your travels that you've seen, and you're probably the most international guest that we've had on, has that topic been raised or come up in what you can tell of like countries just saying, we could spend all this money, or we'll just pull out of the refugee convention and abandon non-refoulement. Is that is that something that's percolating or not at all?
That's an interesting way of putting it. I haven't seen that. Although I'm sure, probably behind closed doors, there's all sorts of discussions being had, especially as, migration once again becomes like the political issue, either in the US election or even in the EU parliamentary elections, which are happening next week, I believe, on the 6th, something like that, 6th of June, 7th of June. But I think, I think it's more about the performance of what these established norms do for countries, right? And the fact that countries want to be seen as being human rights respecting and upholding the Refugee Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all of this, and being a leader, right? All of this stuff, while at the same time being a leader in the kind of AI arms race that we're seeing globally. So it's like this kind of two-part thing that is happening a lot when it comes to state policy.
Yeah.
So I don't think we're going to see any kind of derogations or pullouts or anything. If anything, I mean, operationally, it's going to be a weaker protection system for sure. I don't think anyone's signing up to like resettle more refugees and create new pathways. They talk about it, but nobody ever does it, right? But I think it's still politically advantageous to be seen, especially in the West, kind of in opposition to Russia and other kind of incursions on the kind of human rights framework. Like, we don't want to be like that, but we also don't want to take in more refugees. So,
Mhm.
you know, it's a bit of a performance more than anything.
Yeah, yeah, it is totally performative. And I think that we saw it with, you know, in the Harper era when there was the decision made that really refugees should be resettled from abroad. That was sort of, um, you know, that was the emphasis placed that there that should be the focus. But the challenges that are now presented for people trying to get resettled from abroad, of trying to find and work through a sponsorship agreement holder, getting those group of 5 sponsorships, getting resettled through the UNHCR from abroad, especially, you know, having to be outside of your country of citizenship, all of these things, it hasn't been reconciled. But at the same time, I agree with you that I don't think people are going to ever want to publicly admit that they're not in the business of trying to grant recognition or to offer that protection. But in the meantime, people are being put at greater and greater degrees of risk in trying to actually arrive safely on Canada's borders, in terms of, you know, how they're gonna actually make it here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think we also need to have a conversation about the root causes of migration. And those are the really complicated ones to have, right? Because I think for states that would, especially in the West, it would require a real reckoning in terms of Western imperialism and also our hand in the environmental crisis, and the fact that, you know, it's a lot easier to put up a border wall and handpick a few thousand to come through the resettlement process than to actually think about some sort of global solidarity around the vast power differentials that exist still very much between Canada, US, Europe, and then the rest of the world.
Yeah. There's something quite disingenuous to me always about the conversation about security, because
Yeah.
when there's this ghettoization that occurs, and then there's a concern about security risks. Well, ghettoization creates hostility. That is a fact. And so, you know, you can't, um, you know, it's traumatizing. And then with this repeated trauma, when people have been suffering that over a period of time, that creates anger and hostility, especially when there's that constant rebuff, the constant surveillance, the constant pushback. I'm not sure like how that's not seen as a way of creating hostility and aggression that then is going to have to be dealt with. So, um, so, you know, going back to the source of the conversation again, as you've said, I think that there doesn't seem to be a real willingness to go at it from that.
For sure. And, you know, one kind of trend I've seen time and again is like just how short-sighted a lot of these decisions are, right? Especially what you're bringing up, Deanna, about the kind of securitization and then the kind of radicalization and disenfranchisement that comes as a result of that. I mean, who really is surprised, right? And even when you look at the kind of security paradigm and strengthening the border and managing migration and using all these new tools to create a smart wall and bring in the robo-dogs and whatever, I mean, deterrence is very problematic, and it also just doesn't work, right? Like, when people are desperate, they will continue coming and also exercising their internationally protected right to asylum. But this is something that I've seen at nearly every border, whether you're looking at the maritime borders in Greece or the US-Mexico corridor. People find ways to come. I mean, literally when I was just there a few days ago, talking 2 days ago before this conversation that we're having today, I was in Arizona to share a little bit about the book with some of the search and rescue groups. And, you know, for better or worse, my ethnographer hat is always on. So we ended up driving to the border with my partner, Tom, and a friend, Todd Miller, who is a journalist. And we went to see the wall just to see some of this smart stuff that has been kind of happening there, and some of these new tools. And as we're standing there next to this kind of hulking piece of rusty metal, I see movement out of the corner of my eye. And there was a young man who, in front of our very eyes, jumped across the wall, very tall, but he managed to do it, kind of dusted himself off, looked over at us super quickly, and then ran off into the neighborhood. And this happened right underneath a surveillance tower. I kid you not, like, you really can't make this up. The stories just write themselves sometimes. But to me, that's such a clear example of how there's so much money being spent on surveillance and sharpening the border and making it more violent when it actually doesn't deter people from coming. What it does in these instances is it forces people to take more dangerous routes to try and avoid detection after, the wall, for example. And scholars in Arizona have documented nearly a triple increase of deaths since the introduction of a smart border there. So if we really look at it, what this is doing is it's creating a deadly and a violent border system that's undergirded by this unregulated technology. And that's no accident.
So why does the smart border increase deaths? Notwithstanding the guy who wanted to tase people from drones, but
Yeah.
like it sounds like, and in that case, it sounds like they just run past the tower and the tower may record them.
So in this case, yes, but what we've seen, for example, in the Sonora is that when you have these towers and this kind of surveillance dragnet, some people call it, people become aware of it, right? Because information travels and people share resources in terms of the journeys. And what then happens is people say, well, don't go down this corridor. There's either the border police or there's a lot of surveillance. So like take this increasingly more dangerous corridor, sometimes deeper into the desert through, really inhospitable terrain. And that's where the deaths happen. And same on the maritime frontiers. People have learned, that certain corridors are more policed than others. There's more drones. There's more predictive analytics that are being used. And so people are taking increasingly dangerous routes there as well. So that's really the kind of deadly manifestation of what we're talking about.
But also you described how bad actors will also capitalize upon the vulnerability of those fleeing for their safety. Like the cartels will come and they'll patrol those areas. They're going to exploit women who are fleeing to Canada. That description of the tree that was there and that was an image that will never leave me. And she described a tree where the undergarments of the women who had been assaulted were being thrown. It's just like, and these are things that grow up in these environments that have been cultivated for surveillance and eradication. And so they just are. And I think when we talk about this idea of radicalization, I think that there's no sense of culpability in the radicalization of communities. And I think that that's, I feel this way when we talk about the situation and, in Gaza, we talk about this in the situation and, in all of these different border environments is that when there's conversation about the security risk that arises, again, there seems to be an absence of conversation about how this radicalization occurs. It's not a spontaneous radicalization. It's not an inherent radicalization, but the monitoring, the surveillance, the containment, the ghettoization, all of those things in themselves create that radicalization and create the security risk that you then need to manage. And so it becomes a very circuitous argument where the problem and the cause and the problem that you need to then manage are one and the same. So
yeah, I mean, it is really circular, isn't it? Right. And it also then shows us like what this is really about. I mean, we're talking about a global regime of exclusion. And again, the vast power differentials between those who get to say you belong and you don't. I mean, it's a global system of apartheid, really, the bordering regimes that we are seeing, where a select group of powerful actors get to say, well, you are the wanted ones and you are not, right? But I think, again, it goes back to the questions of like, why are people moving in the first place? And I think oftentimes in the West, we sometimes forget that people don't want to be refugees, right? I mean, I've met over the years hundreds of people, and not one person said like, yeah, this is great. I can, I'm so happy about the situation, right? And I'm not saying that people don't have economic reasons to migrate. Of course they do. And as an aside, I always really struggled with this, even as a lawyer, these kind of extremely rigid dichotomies that we have in the law, that you can be an economic migrant or a refugee and not both at the same time.
For
Like, why
sure.
not? Why
Oh, I
can't
agree
you
with
have
you so
money in the
much.
bank account? You know, like I don't really understand this kind of strange reductionist notion of like how we are as humans. Humans are messy. Human
No, I don't.
movement is,
And I would
right?
never blame anyone for even just being pure economic migrant wanting better. It is weird that you'd tell
Yeah.
someone from a poor country like, well, you're an economic migrant when like who wouldn't do stuff to improve the just the well-being of their children.
But also, I mean,
Absolutely.
for refugees, are a great economic attribute to Canada. So it goes both ways. And the other thing that I think, I talk about this from time to time, but the way that in the Canadian refugee system, and I assume that this is the same everywhere, but I actually don't know whether or not by becoming a protected person in Canada, you're basically saying, I will never go back to my country of origin. Because for a lot of people, that will prevent them from making a refugee claim. Because my experience working with refugees, they don't wish to be forever cut off from their country of origin. They're leaving there because of fear and because of persecution. They Nobody wishes for that to be a perpetual forever situation. Um, Everyone would have a hope that at some point they would be able to be reunited with their homeland. Maybe not everyone, but for a lot of people, that would be the case. And so, but again, this idea that it's like you have to have this final divorce from that place where you came from, and that if you are not willing to do that, you will relinquish any rights to go, that shows that there's something not genuine about the claim in the first place.
In most of Europe, does refugee status lead to permanent residence? I thought it was much strict, not maybe stricter is not the right word, but much stricter, that it's not this pathway to get work permits and permanent residence. Like there really is a separate, maybe I could be wrong, refugee class.
Depends. It depends on the context. I mean, for example, in Greece, if you are one of the lucky ones that goes through the years-long system and eventually gets a refugee residence card, that does allow you to move across to Schengen, for example, and then to eventually get a work permit and things like that, similar to what we have in Canada. But there's also all sorts of kind of temporary protection directives. Also, ones that work in a different way. For example, when the Ukrainian refugees were leaving Ukraine, all of a sudden it became very easy to give every Ukrainian refugee an immediate 3-year permit, right? Why could that have not been the case for Syrian refugees, for example, right?
So what do the
Um,
Syrian refugees get?
well, when they arrived in Greece, for example, if we're talking about the situation in 2015, 2016, when millions of people were coming, a lot of them were warehoused in the camps on the islands where I've done work as well. This was kind of pre the high-tech introduction of
Yeah.
some of the tech. But yeah, people would basically be there, stuck there for years. Some would eventually be processed for refugee adjudication. If they managed to leave, some made their way to Germany, for example, or the Netherlands and tried their luck there. But again, I think it's a lot of these policies are really short-sighted because I mean, I'm not saying anybody should ever be in these camps, but like a lot of people who were coming, were doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, dentists, right? Same with the Syrian refugees that were arriving in Canada, extremely highly skilled folks. I mean, and even if you're not, right? Again, we have this international system that's supposed to function in a way to have cases adjudicated. And instead, I mean, if I can be so bold, we are now spending and wasting so much money on border technology when a fraction of that could be given to lawyers to represent people or for psychosocial social support. I mean, it's amazing the billions of dollars we're talking about being wasted on military grade security apparatus versus how much good this could do to kind of strengthen the system that we have, right?
Hmm.
Or even just to help people address the trauma that they've
Yeah, for sure.
experienced. And because, um, we all know the amount of effort and um, just resources that it takes for people to recover from.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I think my last question, just looking at the time, would be 5 years from now, as you're writing your next book, let's just say, what stories do you think you will have seen? Like, where do you think things are going? You know, will it be more or less the same? Will there be some new hotspot? Um, what do you think the next 5 years looks like?
Well, I'll give you the pessimistic answer and then the optimistic one.
Okay.
So the pessimist in me, or maybe the realist, as someone who has seen so much of this firsthand, I do think that we are going to be seeing more surveillance, more tech, less regulation, because we missed some key moments. Like recently, for example, the European Union launched its AI Act, basically the first regional attempt to govern artificial intelligence. And it could have been a real moment to put some red lines under the really kind of draconian high-risk tech that we've been talking about together at the border, but also things like predictive policing and others. And of course, surprise, surprise, it didn't go as far as it should, right? And it allows for this kind of proliferation to continue. And so if the EU doesn't set a strong standard, why would the US? Why would Canada, right? So I think we're going to see this kind of unbridled techno-solutionism keep happening, especially as this kind of boogeyman of climate migration once again becomes a political kind of pawn, right? Everybody is freaked out about this quote unquote, you know, mass amounts of people that are going to be coming as a result of the environmental crisis, you know, which is true. I mean, we are dealing with an unprecedented number of people who are going to be displaced as a result of this. But again, the answer shouldn't be more technology. It's like, how do we empower communities on the ground to try and stop or reverse some of these really horrific effects? So I do think we're going to be seeing more migration, more technology, less governance. But the optimist in me has also seen the tremendous amount of resistance, information sharing, solidarity work that's being done in these spaces as people are standing up and saying, no, like this is not the world we want. And I think there's also direct ways that we can empower communities directly. That's something we try and do at the Migration Technology Monitor, which is one of the projects I run, where we fund colleagues in displacement directly. We have a fellowship program for people who work on border surveillance and border tech issues. And they're the experts, really, because they're on the ground and they're the ones who really should be in the spotlight, sharing their findings and kind of steering the conversation. It can't just be Silicon Valley and government and those of us concerned about it kind of playing catch up, right? And being like, what about human rights? It really must be led by affected communities and people who are affected by these technologies on the daily. And I do think the conversation is moving there, and maybe the book will do its small part to illuminate some of the things for people too.
Interesting. Yeah, it's hard to predict.
Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely.
Yeah,
Yep.
I'm hopeful for optimism, and I'm just I wonder. I mean, your vision is that where you see the optimism is in those that are observing the ill effects of the technology on the ground, or do you see some promising conversations even at the policy level?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are politicians that are at least aware of what's happening. When I was living in Greece, we had groups of German politicians, the Greens, the Libe Committee, coming down to actually see the manifestations of surveillance, both on part of the human rights defenders and journalists and search and rescuers, like we were talking about, but also what was happening at the border. And so I think actually human storytelling is the key here, is
Right.
talking with policymakers from that perspective and saying this is not an abstract thing to be concerned about, but this is hurting real people and real constituents, if you want to put it that way. So I do
think you're
think,
right, because I think with the Syrian crisis, I think it was like individual storytelling that kind of created some salience for the Canadian public, at least. I think that
Or just that one image of
exactly.
of Alan Kurdi,
Kurdi,
the
yeah.
baby boy.
Yeah, I don't know why it seems to be the one thing that tends
Mm.
to create a,
Mm.
but I don't know. I mean, I think to some extent people are just overexposed at this
Mm.
stage, and I feel like there's a dulling of the senses, and I'm
Mm.
not sure how to to reach that same level at this point,
Mhm.
because I feel like people are just very overwhelmed.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are living through competing crises, right? Still dealing with COVID-19, with environment, with economic issues. And I think, yeah, it can be very overwhelming. But again, I mean, I think there are moments of real deep solidarity. I mean, I have to
Mhm.
say for the first time in a long time, seeing the kind of solidarity around Gaza and Palestine has been really wonderful. And people really kind of looking at the human costs of these conflicts. That again, it goes back to the human, the communities and the storytelling around that, because otherwise it just becomes this mass, like you say, crisis that's very difficult to connect with.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, these are human stories that we have to hold dear. And I think that's what really connects us, right? Is the humanity of all of this.
Yeah.
Right.
So where can
Yeah.
people follow you? You said you're on Twitter
Yes.
or
Yeah.
X.
Yeah. X, Twitter, whatever it's called. Yeah.
What's
On
your
Twitter.
handle?
It's _ P Molnar.
Yeah.
We also have our website, the migrationtechnologymonitor.com, which is available in Arabic, English, Spanish, and French. I have my own website too, if you want to check that out. And the book is available for purchase. You hopefully from small bookstores. It's also on Amazon and apparently at Target and Walmart too, which I was never expecting. But hey,
That's
what it's about.
amazing.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. It's really nice to have a voice that we can all get behind. I think we need some solidarity, and yeah, just and I'm going to follow your optimistic side.
Not the one she
Thank
said was realist.
No, nope. I'm going optimist all the way. That's how I have to
Perfect.
go. Yeah,
That's what we need. Thank
yeah,
you both so much for
definitely,
your interest. I really appreciate the opportunity to share a bit about the
definitely.
work.
Yeah, and thank you all. Thank you very much for the work you're doing.
Thank you.
Awesome.